And the list of books and articles she has authored is so long that if I gave it, we would use up all of her time. One of the best known is Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years, Women, Cloth, and Society in Early Times, and of course, The Mummies of Urumqi. And you will have your full time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope I make it through this. I'm freezing cold and I have a bad cold. We'll see if my voice lasts. The remarkable geological conditions in the Tarim Basin have made the area a gold mine for textile historians. Unfortunately, photographs of cloth usually fail to reveal much that can be deduced from the artifacts. Such was the case when I had to write the textile essay for the catalog to the current exhibit, using only small black and white thumbnail photos, plus, where relevant, the excellent Berlin exhibition catalog, and my notes for those few pieces in the exhibit that I had studied when Professor Mayer invited me to Urumqi in 1995. When I actually saw the textiles a few hours before the exhibit opened in California, I could also see many ways in which the catalog and the exhibition labels were wholly inadequate. The textiles from Chinese Turkestan are far more masterful than stated. This essay attempts, therefore, to straighten out and further piece together the record, so critical to an understanding of early Eurasian textile and costume history. In my 1999 book on the mummies, I noted that the oldest culture found along the Kuruk Dag from around 1800 BC seemed not yet to have worked out the use of color-fast dyes. To obtain color differences, they usually resorted to sorting the different colors of wool that occur naturally on the early wool-bearing sheep: white, beige, golden, chocolate brown, and black. We see this, for example, in woolen blanket wrap number 64 in the exhibit, which has a dark brown warp on one side, milk chocolate warp on the other, and a tan warp in the middle. Thin wedges of plump, well-packed tan weft cover the warp, so-called weft facing, alternating with thin wedges of balanced weave in which the dark warps show through, producing yet other color effects. The blanket thus appears to have 3 large stripes in the warp direction and many slim ones in the weft. The warp ends have been braided and the last weft bound in by wrapping it with extra yarn. A few strange supplementary threads that I noticed 15 years ago, note the arrows, woven into one woman's blanket wrap as pinstripes, led me to hypothesize that the maker had dyed these threads in a bright color to ornament the cloak, but that the dye had faded. Further excavations at Xiaohe have confirmed that occasional ornamental pinstripes, preferably red, were indeed the favorite form of textile ornament. We see them on the tunic-like wrapper of Little Wooden Doll number 59, produced in weft-faced plain weave with strongly reinforced selvages and decorated at the bottom with several short red-brown stripes, which were woven in on the loom, not embroidered afterwards. The tunic is fastened at the shoulders with 2 decorated wooden pins, like those found on the mummies, and held at the waist by a narrow white woven band or sash with twined selvages. Like many of the mummies, she wears a felted woolen bonnet, and near her left shoulder are 4 little spherical bundles tied into the edge of the blanket wrap with short lengths of red-brown yarn. Compare, for example, the female mummy found by Sven Hedin in 1934 with its hood, blanket wrap, and 3 bundles containing ephedra. Ephedra, which has been mentioned several times now, is a reedy-looking plant that contains a mild amount of stimulant and bronchial dilator. It's found in almost all these early burials, but we don't know why it was used by this culture. Its earliest cultural attestation is in the Merv Oasis to the west around 2100 BC. Another wooden doll, number 53, this one male, also sports a few short red pinstripes on his wrapper, which he wears much shorter as a belted tunic. Most remarkable, however, are his copper or bronze hoop earrings. We almost never find metal in the early Tarim graves, whether because of taboo or reuse. And we do find mummies with pierced earlobes. Here at last we get a glimpse of their jewelry. Pinstripes also adorned hats and blankets, as seen in a photo of the owner of fiber felt hat number 49 of the exhibit. The beauty of Xiaohe's blanket wrap, number 61, provides another example of these techniques and more. The cloak is entirely in plain weave. That is, the threads pass over one and under one in each direction. The stripes were produced by several rows of thick weft, which made a balanced plain weave. That is about the same number of threads running in each direction as you see up here. Alternating with several rows of quite thin weft in a more weft-faced plain weave, as you see up here. The latter tend to look darker than the former. Often these stripes peter out in a skinny wedge shape. That is, they don't go all the way across the fabric. Now that can be done deliberately, but it's typical of a weaving in which the warp threads don't all have the same tension, because limper warp threads will prevent the rows of weft from packing closely, whereas tighter warp threads will allow the weft to lie closely if you beat it in hard. Oops. 3 of the original edges of the lady's cloak are visible, showing us much about how it was woven. The cloth was started along the edge now around her ankles. This starting edge is a closed selvage where the warp threads loop back into the cloth, and the edge has been strengthened by twining the first 2 weft threads around each other as they cross the fabric. This means that the beginning of the cloth must have been lashed to one beam of the loom, the cloth beam. The side selvages were also reinforced, but by wrapping extra yarn around the outermost threads. It's hard to tell without a microscope whether this was done during the weaving or after the piece was finished. Blanket number 64 is done similarly. By the lady's shoulder, one can see part of the closing border. The warp ends were braided together and the last weft was wrapped with extra yarn. These details suggest that the loom used was a 2-beam loom, almost certainly a ground loom, similar to that used in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and in parts of the Middle East yet today. This is a Bedouin setup. Since you can peg it out as big as you please, it can readily produce the huge blanket wraps, unlike the narrow backstrap looms that the Chinese show themselves employing for silks. Note that since looms are merely clever aggregates of plain sticks, they are seldom identifiable in the archaeological record. The earliest Central Asian representation from Dandan Uylik is AD and shows the narrow Chinese type. And you can see the equipment a little bit better in this excerpt that I did with the loom at the lower center. Oops. There's a reel over here and cocoons there, and she's got a beater in her hand, much like the one that's in the exhibition. 2 more remarks before we move to later cultures. First, the grass basket, number 55, was woven in a technique called weft twining, in which 2 weft twist around each other every time they go over or under a warp element. And here you see it in situ at the top left. This weaving technique is attested back to 25,000 BC in Europe at a Paleolithic site in the Czech Republic, and again in the early Neolithic in Israel and Turkey. Second, the gorgeous eyelashes of the beauty of Xiaohe finally proved my 1999 deduction from little details at Zaganluk, namely that those bodies that mummified had to have died early in winter, flash freezing and gradually freeze drying over the next few months, whereas other bodies decomposed. People keep appropriating my deduction without citing any clinching evidence. But here's the evidence. Eyeballs, being wet, cause rapid decomposition of both themselves and the eyelids with their lashes when warm. But by the same token, being wet, both they and the thin overlying eyelids will freeze rapidly when very cold, thus preserving the eyelashes in place. Now let's look at the later cultures. In 1999, I described the fabrics excavated initially at Zagınluk, including the 3-month-old baby with the blue bonnet. By 800 BC, people had clearly worked out the problem of fixing red, blue, and yellow plant dyes. The gorgeous blue on the bonnet is almost certainly indican. Whether that is from woad or indigo, we don't know. And the remarkable hue is typically the result of indican on cashmere, a fiber that Irene Good identified elsewhere in that same tomb. The weaves remain simple. The texture stripe in the baby's wrapper results from using 3 rows of overspun yarn in plain weave, while the interesting border on the shawl from this tomb results from alternating rows of red and blue weft in a weft-faced plain weave. And one of my students and I wove a replica, which you're welcome to look at if you have clean hands. The baby's presumed father, who's accompanying horsehide, saddle, and horse sacrifice, peg him as a horseman, wears a type of garment that must have been fairly new then, trousers, complete with a gusset set on the bias for more comfortable horseback riding. His are the earliest pants and gussets that we have. The somewhat later pants in, here's the diagram. The somewhat later pants in the exhibit, number 42, are even roomier. Pants seem to have been developed specifically for horse riding. Another piece of gear developed by the horsemen was the shabrak, or showy saddle blanket spread between horse and rider. The one with a handsome leaf pattern from Sampula, number 41, was made in pile carpet technique. Close inspection of rips in the fabric show that the weaver used the symmetrical pile knot, exactly as in the famous Pazyryk carpet of about 400 BC. That's the red one on this side. And unlike the somewhat earlier shabrak from Bash Adar, which is done in symmetrical knotting, which is the one pointed up in green on the far side, the Pazyryk carpet actually pictures horses wearing fancy shabraks. Some of the early fragments of pile work from Sampula suggest the origins of pile rugs. These scraps show that several rows of plain weave, which is quickly done, intervene between each time-consuming row of pile knotting. The pile is then left quite long to cover the plain weft, a much easier, quicker way of making a knotted rug than knotting every second row. Clearly, the long shag of this rug has worn away, but you can see the rows of colored knotting. The pattern of the Sampula fragments, when pieced together, consists of simple concentric rings of different colors, as in the very archaic Tulu carpets still used as sleeping rugs by 19th century Kurds and woven in exactly this same way. Another technique handsomely represented in the Tarim Basin in the first millennium BC is tapestry. Plain weave, faced weaves, and pile can all be monochrome. But tapestry is one of several techniques specifically for making polychrome designs. You wouldn't put all that work into it if you weren't making polychrome designs. Each color of weft is woven back and forth across the bare warp, exactly where that color is needed, then packed tightly to cover the warp. That is, it is weft-faced. There is no other weft holding the cloth together, so it takes careful planning. Unfortunately, slits in the cloth will develop where two colors keep going around neighboring warp threads, row after row, as in this modern Turkish rug. Look right directly above the arrows, and you will see one of those slits. The solution is to design the pattern to minimize straight lines parallel to the warp. But for the analyst, the slits are a dead giveaway to the patterning technique. So, when we spot little telltale slits in the flowers on a pair of handsome boots, number 83, we know that the design was woven on the loom in tapestry, not embroidered. The decorative facade of the boots, including the rainbow striped sides, is entirely woven and tightly weft-faced. The weft runs parallel to the bands, to the pattern band, and the warp runs across the instep. You can see the slits developing between the neighboring warp threads as weft of different colors stop and turn around row after row so as to stay within their respective color fields. This slitting can't happen with embroidery, since there the stitches are applied to an already woven cloth. In fact, the pattern has been cleverly designed by master weaver to minimize the instability of the cloth necessarily caused by slits. For the record, the earliest preserved slit tapestry comes from Egypt about 1480 BC, while various evidence suggests origins in Syria by 2400 BC. Another solution to the problem of slits can be seen in this woolen mirror bag, number 86. The little pattern strip down the middle of this attractive bag is done in pushed or deformed tapestry, woven in while the cloth was on the loom, where the different colored weft threads running parallel to the stripe were simply shoved around on the warp, which runs across the bag, to make them sit where wanted for the design, with others of a different color woven in to hold them there. Again, this technique is far more difficult, more masterful than simple embroidery, which is what the catalog and labels call it. But the most magnificent piece of tapestry in the exhibit, and perhaps the finest that has survived from the ancient world, is the fragment of what must have been a huge wall hanging, number 38, showing a centaur with a flying cape and a horn as part of a dark frame full of foliage and critters around the main scene, and below this, a guardsman with a long spear. The weaving is masterful, as fine as on any Gobelin tapestry. And the Berlin catalog says that they actually counted 23 different colors of thread. Note the details around the man's eyes and mouth and on the spearhead, which intrudes into the frame of the picture. A pale yellow headband with a thin red stripe corrals the guard's long black hair, apparently braided in cornrows over his scalp. Both the man's face and the centaur, a figure from Greek mythology, suggest origins farther west, perhaps Bactria or Persia. Although clearly woven as part of a wall hanging, this and an adjoining piece not in the exhibit were found remade into a pair of trouser legs. If we add the other piece, we can see that the spearman wears a hip-length red coat edged in yellow over a fancy flowered shirt or vest held in by a belt of square silver plates. The headband and the red coat show that he is dressed in accordance with Persian royalty, another indicator of its westerly source. In addition to tapestry, the exhibition has numerous brocades, produced by yet another pattern weaving technique. Take, for example, number 7-2, labeled Shoes with Embroidered Characters in the catalog and label. The Chinese characters on this magnificently wrought pair of slippers are again not embroidered. That would have been easy. Embroidery refers specifically to adding ornamentation to a finished cloth by means of stitches taken with a needle and thread. Instead, the characters here have been woven in with colored weft, a process requiring far more skill. Notice that all the red characters are in one line, all the blue ones in another. Blue, red. This is where supplementary wefts of red or blue are running through the cloth. They typically float along underneath the ground weft that holds the cloth together. As you see in the underside at the right of this modern example, and you can look at that one too, both sides, and they are brought to the surface exactly where needed for the design, as you see on the left. This technique, called brocade, is particularly suited to bringing out the beauties of silk fiber, and Chinese artisans seem to have started experimenting with it already in by 1500 BC. So when these shoes were woven, Chinese weavers were already great masters at this technique, and it's a pity that the labels don't give them credit. But there's more. The fabric has actually been shaped during the weaving to fit the toe of the shoe, another very difficult and masterful technique. You can see that some bands of a given width taper to a point to shape the cloth. Some of these bands, note especially the dark blue bands with white edges near the top of the shoe, were even woven as tapestry. The entire cloth is weft faced with the weft packed closely to hide the warp. There are many other brocades in the exhibit. For example, excavators at Nia unearthed a charming couple fairly smothered in them, several of whose fabrics are in the exhibit, unfortunately in 4 different rooms. The checkered dress, the 2 oblong face masks of the deceased, one of which was made from the same brocade fabric as a pair of mittens. Here's the face cloth, and here are the mittens, 4 rooms away, plus a large coverlet, not, I think, actually quilted as the label implies, but a magnificent brocade. Yet another technique occurs on a fancy silk robe number 72. The pattern is so small that it's hard to even see up close, but there's a tiny lozenge-based design on the light blue silk and also on the white silk patch on the right shoulder, which is once again not embroidered, but woven in, apparently, in damask technique. In damask, the threads of ground warp and ground weft simply hop over and under more than one thread of the other system where needed to form the design. And I noticed looking through the exhibit here, one of the small doll, I believe it's number 19 in the catalog, with a gold robe on it, gold-colored silk robe on it, also has a beautiful small damask pattern on its silk. It's better lit than it was at the Bowers, and so you can see it quite clearly. Among the most spectacular fabrics in the exhibit are, of course, those worn by Ying Pan Man, number 80. And here we see yet another type of weave, for his woolen kaftan is done in double weave. This technique creates 2 complete layers of cloth at the same time, which are bound together by the threads crossing through each other where the designs are. Thus, on one face, yellow warp and weft are brought to the surface to form the patterns, symmetrical goats, naked putti, fighting, and foliage, while red warp and weft form the background. On the other face, which we can't see except where there's a small tear, the same figures will occur in red on a yellow background. The patterns strongly recall Greco-Roman art, as does the grapevine pattern on the only other piece of double weave that I've seen from Xinjiang, this one from Sampul. Note that what is yellow on one side, like the grapes, lower center, are blue on the other side. The design suggests that such pieces were made somewhere towards the eastern end of the Roman Empire and traded eastward into the Tarim Basin. We know that the Greeks were already doing pattern double weave, simple pattern double weave by 500 BC, and I have a replica of a Greek one here where you can take it and turn it over and see how it flips color. Finally, we come to true embroidery. Yingpan man's trousers, as well as his blue cuff and pillow, are masterfully embroidered in chain stitch with woolen thread on silk cloth. Both the stitch used and some of the delicate curly patterns resemble the early silk embroidery found in a frozen tomb at Pazarik, 500 miles due north of Yingpan, a 4th century BC Chinese silk made into a saddlecloth or shabrak. And here is a detail of that Pazarik pattern. My final example, number 25-1, and like number 84-4, bears the most popular textile pattern in Central and Western Asia from the 7th to the 13th century AD. That's 500 years. It was manufactured chiefly by Sogdians and has the nickname of the pearl roundels. These cloths are woven not in brocade, but in samit, a weft-faced compound twill. Now, I had a dress of this material when I was in high school, and I was told it was brocade. In fact, I now know it's a beautiful example of samit. Samit is a weft-faced compound twill where a second set of wefts form the design, and the surface is satin-like. The design consists here of row after row of small pearl-like frames framing a central field with a repeated design in it, often of people or animals. In the other piece in the exhibit, there's some kind of a toothsome animal head in the center. Another repeated design fills the interstices between the rows and columns. What's particularly charming to a textile historian is that this exhibit happens to contain a nice example of the source of this design, which was inspired by popular jewelry. Number 79 is a gold ring from several centuries earlier. Its stone bezel has a picture on it, shows a seated girl, and the engraved scene is surrounded by nice round gold beads, exactly as in the textile pattern. I hope this discussion of the actual techniques used to create this remarkable collection of fabrics will be of lasting usefulness to textile historians. In the textiles of this exhibit, we have a unique glimpse at how much we've lost of the ancient world. Thank you. These were all keyed to the catalog. I believe these papers are being published? Yes. So when this comes out, you'll have it completely keyed to the catalog.
I wondered what your theory is on why that wonderful large tapestry had been made into pants. And clearly it was huge at one point.
Yes, you can see from the man's head that it's considerably bigger than life size. And so the entire tapestry, if it showed all of the man, which it presumably did, would have been, the size of this projection screen, probably something like that. The scenario that I read somewhere, and I at the moment don't remember where, it may have been in the Berlin catalog, was that a bunch of screaming marauders had yanked it down off of a palace wall, probably in Bactria or Persia, carried it off to Xinjiang, cut it up, made trousers out of it, but then what goes around comes around because the body it was found on was of a warrior who himself had been stabbed in the heart in some raid or other. So it seems to have had a rather colorful history, but that's about all we can deduce.
Over here. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the little suit of clothing that happens to be on the chest of Yingpan Man?
I was asking Victor Mayer that just last night. whether it's for dolls or for the next world. He says the current theory is that it's for an extra suit of clothes for the next world. And if you look in most ancient paintings that show somebody dying, just in the final stages of dying, they show the body is shown this long, the soul is shown coming out of the mouth, and it's about proportional in size to those little suits of clothing. So that may very well be right. Yes. There's questions over there.
Hi, your book inspired me to go to Urumqi to see the mummies for myself. I wondered why there are no examples of the plaids, the tartans, in this exhibit, and can you talk about those a little bit?
Well, they are actually not from the Tarim Basin, but from the next basin to the northeast. It's a separate culture, a separate group of things, and I assume that it was simply a matter of compactness, not to range across all of Central Asia. That is a separate area where those cloths come from.
Hi. In reference to the book, Mummies of Urumqi, you mentioned Kumihimo. Is it at all possible that it ended up in Japan via the Ainu, who were Caucasian?
I don't know that. We don't have anything in between to show us the exact route from which those round cords, like the one that is used as a belt band by Church-in Man, we don't have any evidence between there and Japan as to the route by which things came in. However, I want to also put on public record the fact that when I was in Copenhagen several years ago at a textile conference, a lady plopped down next to me at lunch and opened up a box full of cords, a couple of which she tried to make an exact replica of Church-in Man's band, and also of some of the flat bands which are made into clothes. And you could see that in the textile that was on my title page, these cloths that are made up of narrow bands. And she said, you don't need kumihimo equipment to do that. You can do this all by finger looping. Now, meanwhile, my eyes were falling out of my head because in the bottom of the box, there was a couple of cords that she hadn't brought out. And they were identical to ones that we saw dozens of when we were there in Urumqi, and they were so simple and so ubiquitous that I never bothered to get photographs of them. And so I plucked one of these out and I said, did you make this by the same techniques? And she said, yes. So this has pretty well convinced me that probably it wasn't done with the, unless we find the actual bobbins, that it was probably done by finger looping technique rather than where you don't need any equipment at all except your fingers and your toe to to tie the other end to. So we would need to find actual equipment to know if the kumihimo technique with the bobbins goes all the way across, but we got lots of those bobbins in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. I actually brought a cord myself, but was wondering if there was also a correlation to the sherdaks that are still produced in Kyrgyzstan in felt, because that's what they're, and you just do it by cording it by finger, but it was traditionally a Kyrgyz technique.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any theory on the baby's blue bonnet, on why that was not felted at all.
Well, if you've ever watched a baby squirming around, you would have to think that was put on after the baby died, because the baby would have destroyed that with a few squirms, because it is just combed and patted down. And so I have to assume that that is a funerary garment.
it would be an expensive one if it was blue and red.
Yes.
And that was my
yes,
last
yes.
question.
But
if-
it's the same kind of stuff that the church and man's leggings are made of. So presumably they had lots of this combed wool that was dyed up in bright colors. I always liken his leggings to Ronald McDonald. I mean, you know, they're just like really bright. But they are simply felted. And there they were, depending upon the kneading process of walking around in them, inside the leather boots to do that. But I don't see how the baby could have, I mean, how that bonnet would have lasted on the baby. In fact, it hasn't lasted very well since I first saw it in 1995, because you now see there's a red layer underneath the blue layer, and you couldn't see that in 1995. It's gotten, you know, mushed around just enough.
Yeah, could you comment on how simple or complex a loom would be needed for the damask or the brocades, especially the wider widths?
Well, I would hate to do those as a pickup pattern, which suggests that, especially since it's very evenly repeated, and the pattern threads in both the warp and weft have to be repeated to get that design. That suggests to me that they already had pattern heddles, but then we know that the people in Gordian, in Turkey, in the I forget exactly what it was about. I think the 8th century, 7th century BC already had pattern heddles, because you can see mistakes that run through the whole series of patterns. I think they already had pattern heddles, but both of those damasks are, from my point of view as a prehistorian, pretty late. But once you've got the idea of a heddle at all, it's not that hard to think up a pattern heddle. What's hard to think up, is how you would construct a discontinuous stick, which is what you need to go from a shed stick to a heddle stick. And that is such a difficult concept that I am convinced that it was invented once and spread all the way around the world from one location, which must have been somewhere in Western Eurasia or Southeastern Europe in the late Paleolithic, and that it got all the way. We know how it got to the New World from Korea, and so forth. So, that's another story. But anyway, it does seem to have gone around the world from a single point of origin. So, but that was 7, 8, 9,000 BC. So by this time, by the first millennium BC or AD, that's a piece of cake. Okay.
Is anything known about the women who were the weavers? Did they have any special status? Were they allotted time free from other chores?
We know absolutely nothing. In fact, you just saw what pitiful evidence I was adducing for figuring out what kind of loom they even used. We know nothing about the weavers. We do not, there's 1 or 2 spindles known. I think one of them is in the exhibit, the little one. There's a bigger one that's carved. We have almost no information. We don't know if it was men or women. Traditionally, it has been women, but it could have been men.
We have a 15-minute break. Everybody, please come back at 3:15 for the last session.